Hello everybody, and welcome to part 2 of my video series on Plantinga's modal ontological argument. In part 1 of this series, which should be linked below in the description, we covered the philosophical background for the modal ontological argument, we gave the argument, and explained why, even if it is sound, it is not persuasive. In this part, I will address some efforts to justify the modal ontological argument as a tool of persuasion and explain, using the ideas of Part 1, why I believe these fail. Part 3 will go into S5 modal logic and its relation to the modal ontological argument. So why does the modal ontological argument seem to be persuasive, even if it really isn't? So in Part 1 of this series, I argued that the modal ontological argument isn't really effective as a persuasive argument, but it is enticing when one first looks at it. I just have to show it's possible God exists, and then God exists. And of course, many people do try to use it as an apologetic tool. So why does the modal ontological argument seem to be persuasive if, as I argued in part 1 of this series, it can't really be persuasive? Well, I believe there are two reasons. The first reason is, in everyday usage, we usually use the words possible or impossible to mean epistemically possible or impossible. And if we interpret premise 1 to mean it is epistemically possible a maximal great being exists, then it is at least defensible. Now, some people will still attempt to criticize it. They might try to argue that maximal great being is not epistemically possible. They'll try to find a contradiction in the definition of omnipotence or omniscience or something like that. But I still think that if we're talking about epistemic possibility, it's at least defensible that it is epistemically possible a maximal great being exists without having to argue directly that a maximally great being exists. The problem with this is premise 2 can only be justified using a metaphysical definition of possibility and necessity. To justify premise 1 by interpreting possibility as epistemic possibility, and justify premise 2 by interpreting possibility as metaphysical possibility, is to commit the fallacy of equivocation. The party presenting an argument may define their terms however they like, but they must be consistent in applying their definitions. So I believe the second reason why the modal ontological argument seems to be persuasive, even if it really isn't, is we are not used to reasoning about metaphysically necessary entities. And if we're not careful, when supporting premise 1, we're liable to treat God like any other contingent being. But assuming God exists, God is not just another contingent entity among all the other contingent entities. In other words, God is not like a unicorn. So, for example, I've heard people say things like, no one has proven God doesn't exist. Can you prove God doesn't exist? The idea of a maximal great being appears to be perfectly coherent. The definition of a maximal great being does not seem obviously self-contradictory in the way the concept of a married bachelor is. Therefore, we should grant it's possible a maximal great being exists. So the problem with this is that these are all arguments involving epistemic possibility as modeled in S4. These are arguments about what can be proven or demonstrated. A married bachelor in particular can be demonstrated to be logically impossible merely by unwinding the definition. At best, these arguments suggest it is epistemically possible a maximal great being exists, but these arguments do nothing to confirm it is metaphysically possible a maximal great being exists. They do nothing to support the first premise of the modal ontological argument. But then we can ask, but don't we usually assume something is metaphysically possible if it's epistemically possible? After all, you're willing to grant it's metaphysically possible a unicorn exists. Why not God? Well, because God is not like a unicorn. In the case of a unicorn, it makes sense to say the idea of a unicorn appears to be coherent. Therefore, whether unicorns exist or not, it seems fair to assume there is a way the world would have been that would have resulted in unicorns existing if the world had been that way. But it would make no sense to say the definition of a maximally great being appears to be coherent. it doesn't appear we can draw a contradiction from it the way we can a married bachelor. So regardless of whether God exists or not, it seems reasonable to assume there is some way the world could have been, such that if the world had been that way, it would have resulted in God existing. Well, it doesn't matter if the definition of a maximally great being is epistemically coherent or not. The world could not have been a way that would have resulted in God existing. And it makes no sense to say there would be a way the world could have been such that God would have existed regardless of whether God exists or not. Assuming God exists, every way the world could have been is a way the world could have been such that God would have existed if the world had been that way. And if God did not exist, there would be no way the world could have been such that God would have existed if the world had been that way. Not because the definition of a maximally great being would be epistemically incoherent, not because we would be able to derive a contradiction from the definition of a maximally great being, but purely because God is conceived to be a necessary being whose existence or non-existence is not contingent on the condition of the world. Saying that we should assume there is a way the world could have been such that God would have existed if the world had been that way, because the idea of a maximally great being appears to be coherent, is saying we just should assume God exists, because the idea of a maximally great being appears to be coherent. And there is no reason we should expect a skeptic to grant God exists, merely because the definition of a maximally great being appears to be coherent. Now, what's going on here is that the modal ontological argument uses a formal axiom system, S5 modal logic, which assumes we are speaking about possibility in a metaphysical sense. This allows us to establish the second premise of the modal ontological argument. But if we're going to use a formal axiomatic system, we have to use it consistently. We can't just use it when it's convenient and ignore it otherwise. We can't use the S5 modal axiom system to establish the second premise of the argument and then ignore it when attempting to establish the first. So if we want to support the first premise of the modal ontological argument, we must show it is metaphysically possible a maximally great being exists. And that means we must show there is a way the world could have been such that God would have existed if the world had been that way. Well, what if someone says, but I can conceive of a way the world could have been in which it is true that God exists. I not only conceive of it, I believe in it. And this conception seems to be entirely coherent to me. I see nothing internally incoherent in my worldview. Well, the key word here is conceive. Possibility as conceivability is another form of epistemic possibility. To show the first premise of the modal ontological argument is true, it's not sufficient to show that we can coherently conceive of a world in which God exists. We must show that there is a way the world could have been such that God would have existed if the world had been that way. And even if we can coherently conceive of a world in which it is true God exists, if God didn't actually exist in reality, there would be no way the world could have been such that God would have existed if the world had been that way. Not because we wouldn't be able to coherently conceive of a world in which it is true that God exists, not because the idea of a maximally great being would then be demonstrably internally incoherent in the sense of a married bachelor, but purely because it logically can't be the case both that a necessary being doesn't exist and that that being would have existed if the world had turned out differently. Now, I'm repeating myself, but again, if we're going to use a formal axiomatic system, we have to use it consistently. We can't just use it when it's convenient and ignore it otherwise. We can't use the axiom system S5 to establish the second premise of the argument and then ignore it when attempting to establish the first. To successfully defend premise 1, we must defend it using the definition of a maximally great being and the assumptions of S5 modal logic. What does that mean? Well, if we want to support the first premise of the modal ontological argument, we must show it is metaphysically possible a maximally great being exists. To do that, we must show there is a way the world could have been such that a maximally great being would have existed if the world had been that way. And since a maximally great being is defined to be a maximally excellent being that exists necessarily, We must show there's a way the world could have been such that some proposed being would have been a maximally excellent being and would have existed and existed necessarily if the world had been that way. And working in S5, to verify that a proposed being, which would have existed if the world had been a particular way, would have existed necessarily if the world had been that way, we must show that that being exists and is a necessary being. And so, we must show that that proposed maximally excellent being exists and is a maximally great being. In short, to support the first premise of the modal ontological argument, we must show a maximally great being exists. If we apply the same definition and assumptions to the first premise of the argument that we do to justify the second, there is no way around this. Okay, but what if someone replies, I don't care what you say. I have a strong intuition that it is metaphysically possible God exists. I trust this intuition, and therefore the modal ontological argument tells me God does exist. Well, first of all, speaking personally, if someone tells me they have an intuition God exists, I may or may not share that intuition, but I will at least respect it. Plantinga argued that we have properly basic beliefs, beliefs in things, such as the existence of other minds, that we believe in firmly, but would be hard-pressed to justify. So, just speaking personally again, I certainly believe that there are other minds than my own, that they're real, not figments of my own mind, but if you ask me to give a philosophical justification for that, I wouldn't know how to start. So the idea of properly basic beliefs seems reasonable to me, and one might be able to defend intuitions as properly basic beliefs. But then, having said that, why say I have an intuition it's metaphysically possible God exists, instead of saying I have an intuition God exists? The former is not really a weaker claim than the latter. It just appears to be weaker because we're used to thinking of possibility as epistemic possibility. But when we say it's metaphysically possible God exists, we're not saying God might exist. We're not saying might anything. When we say it's metaphysically possible God exists, we're saying there is a way the world could have been such that God would have existed if the world had been that way. And of course, the only way that could be true is if God exists. If someone says, I'm not saying God exists, it's just that I have an intuition it is metaphysically possible God exists, what they are saying is, I have an intuition not that God exists, but that God would have existed if the world had been somehow different than it is now. But why would someone say that if they understood that God is a necessary being and that the world is incapable of being a particular way that would result in God existing if God did not exist? I can't think of any good answer to that question. Okay, so that concludes part 2 of my video series on Plantinga's modal ontological argument. Part 3 of this series is on S5 modal logic and its relation to the modal ontological argument, and it will also argue that the modal ontological argument places no additional burden on the atheist. Thank you, everyone, for watching.